Emma wasn't supposed to be home that Friday night. She'd told me she had a work dinner, something last minute that her boss wanted her to attend. I had zero reason to doubt it. She'd been putting in long hours lately, even taking on extra projects. And in all honesty, I was looking forward to a quiet night. The kids were out, and I had a steak and a good whiskey lined up for the evening. But around 10 p.m., as I was about to pour myself that drink, I heard her car in the driveway. It didn't make sense. The event was supposed to be downtown, easily an hour from home. I walked to the window, watched her step out of the car, and what I saw next froze me in place. A man got out of the passenger side. Not just any man, this guy looked young, maybe in his late 20s, and had that smug confidence plastered across his face that's impossible to mistake. He lingered by her side, and she didn't look uncomfortable. No, she was smiling, laughing even, as she handed him a bag. They stood close, just a bit too close, like there was something between them that didn't belong in our driveway. My blood turned cold. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, but I couldn't look away, either. The two of them talked for a few moments, and then he leaned down and kissed her on the cheek. She didn't pull back, in fact, she looked pleased. Then she turned, gave him a little wave, and he sauntered back to his car and drove off, leaving her standing there, staring after him with a smile. I stepped away from the window, feeling the heat rise in my chest. The woman I had spent the last 15 years with, the mother of my kids, was out there, smiling after some guy like a lovesick teenager. 100 thoughts fought for space in my head, but one thing was certain: whatever was going on, she had been lying to me for a long time. I heard her key in the lock. I stood there, pressed back in the shadows of the hallway, heart pounding as Emma stepped through the front door. She was humming, actually humming, like she'd just had the best night of her life. It felt sickeningly out of place. She didn't turn on any lights, didn't even call out my name to see if I was around. She just floated into the kitchen, dropped her purse on the counter, and poured herself a glass of wine like it was any other Friday night. I stayed silent, watching her, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. I wanted to confront her right there, demand answers. But something stopped me. I didn't want a half-baked story. I wanted the truth, unfiltered, undeniable. So, I stayed quiet and kept my distance. Eventually, she went upstairs to our bedroom, still lost in her own little world. I waited, letting her settle, giving myself time to calm down so I wouldn't burst in there like a madman. My hands were shaking, and I had to grip the edge of the counter to steady myself. When I finally heard the shower running, I went to the garage. Her car was still warm from the drive. I opened the door and peered inside, knowing I was crossing a line, but I didn't care. If she was going to bring some stranger home, she had to be careless enough to leave evidence behind. On the passenger seat was a takeout bag, a little greasy around the edges. I pulled it open. Some high-end Thai place in the city, the kind of place she always told me was too fancy or too expensive to bother with. The receipt was tucked in the bag with 2 orders listed. 2 orders. Next to the bag was something else, a small, expensive-looking watch. Definitely not mine, and definitely not hers. A guy's watch. I recognized the brand because I'd looked at the same one a few months back but passed because of the price tag. The band was dark leather, and the face had a scratch running diagonally across it, almost like it had been caught on something sharp. I turned it over in my hand, feeling the weight of it, feeling the weight of everything that must have been going on without me seeing it. I stood there, staring at that watch, trying to remember every moment from the last few months that seemed strange, and I realized how much I'd ignored. The late nights, the unexplained absences. The times she'd brushed off my questions or joked about my paranoia. All the little details I'd told myself didn't matter because she was my wife, and I'd convinced myself she'd never betray me like this. I pocketed the watch and closed the car door. I knew it was a risk to take it, but I wanted to keep something concrete, something I could hold when she inevitably tried to deny everything. Back inside, I waited until I heard her climb into bed. I needed to confront her. Needed to lay this out and see if she'd squirm or deny or try to deflect. I wanted to hear the words from her own mouth, whatever she tried to spin. When I walked into the bedroom, she was lying in bed, scrolling through her phone. She looked up, surprised, like she hadn't expected to see me. Her reaction was all the confirmation I needed. Late night? I asked, keeping my voice steady, though my fists were clenched at my sides. She blinked, the question obviously throwing her off for a second before she plastered on an easy smile. Yeah, she said, too casually. Dinner ran late. My boss is impossible, you know? He kept us all their way past normal. Must have been quite the dinner, I replied, my voice tight. So interesting you didn't even notice me standing in the hallway when you came in. Her face changed in an instant. The casual ease was gone, replaced with a flash of panic she tried to hide. She looked away, shifting the phone in her hands, and forced a small laugh. Oh, you were up? I didn't even see you, hon, you know me, always off in my own little world after a long day. Yeah, I saw you, too, I said. And I saw the guy who dropped you off. The one who kissed you goodnight. She went pale, her mouth falling open just slightly. Her fingers tightened around her phone, and I saw the gears turning in her head as she tried to come up with an explanation, a lie, anything that could undo what I'd just thrown at her. It's not what it looks like, she said finally, her voice a whisper. Really? Because from where I was standing, it looked pretty straightforward. You and some guy, cozy as can be in the driveway, like you've done this 100 times before. She bit her lip, glancing away, and for a moment, I thought she might just come clean. Instead, she sighed heavily, looking at me with an expression that could have passed for pity. You're overreacting, John. It's not what you think. I let out a laugh, cold and bitter. Then why don't you tell me what it is, Emma? Explain it to me, because I'd love to hear how this makes any sense. She stayed silent, her eyes flicking back to the door as if she could just slip out of this conversation if she tried hard enough. Finally, she shrugged, her voice dropping to a soft murmur. He's just a friend. We were at the same event, and he offered to drop me off. It's nothing more than that. I shook my head, taking a step closer. That's your story? You're sticking with just a friend? Yes, John. God, you're acting like I've done something horrible. He's just someone from work. We had a drink, he drove me home. That's it. End of story. Then what about this? I pulled the watch from my pocket and held it up between us. Did your friend accidentally leave this behind too? Because it sure doesn't look like yours, and it sure as hell isn't mine. Her face went blank, and she stared at the watch, not even trying to hide her shock this time. It was as if she hadn't realized the small details she'd missed in her rush to cover her tracks. John, please, she whispered, her voice cracking just slightly. It's not what you think. I didn't mean for you to find out like this. It just happened. It was supposed to stay separate from us. I felt a surge of anger that nearly made me slam the watch against the wall. Stay separate from us? What the hell does that even mean, Emma? How long has this been going on? She was silent, staring down at the sheets, her hands twisting nervously. She wasn't going to answer, not unless I forced it out of her. Is this why you've been working so many late nights? Why you never tell me where you are anymore? Yes, she finally said, her voice barely audible. Yes, all right. It started a few months ago. It wasn't supposed to be anything serious. I just needed something different. I didn't plan for it to get this far. The words hung in the air, each one cutting deeper than the last. I wanted to scream, to demand she tell me why she'd felt the need to go behind my back like this. But more than anything, I wanted her to feel the weight of what she'd done, the utter betrayal she'd thrown at me with barely a second thought. So, what now? I asked, forcing my voice to stay steady. You want to just keep pretending this is normal? That I should just go along with it? She didn't answer. She didn't even look at me. And in that silence, the last shred of trust I'd held onto shattered completely. I didn't wait for her answer. I sat down on the edge of the bed, forcing her to look at me, forcing her to stay in the moment. She'd thrown away our marriage like it was some temporary thing that could be brushed off when it got inconvenient. My mind was spinning as I tried to piece together a plan, a way to get the truth out of her, all of it. You're going to start talking, I said, my voice cold. All of it, Emma. No more lies, no more games. What's his name? She looked down, clutching at the sheets like they could somehow shield her from the conversation. It doesn't matter, she whispered. The hell it doesn't matter. Who is he? When she didn't answer, I felt something snap in me. I reached over and grabbed her wrist, not hard, but enough to make her look up. What's his name? Alex, she finally said, her voice small. His name is Alex. Alex what? I pressed. Is he married? Does he have kids? Or is he just some loser with no commitments who likes to mess with other people's lives? She closed her eyes, letting out a shaky breath. He's not married, no kids. He works with me, okay? I met him at an office event last year, and it just... I don't know, it just happened. I let go of her wrist, feeling like I'd been punched in the gut. So, what, you got bored? Was that it? We were too routine, too predictable, so you thought you'd just have a little adventure on the side? It's not like that, she said, her voice defensive. I didn't plan for it to happen. I just felt like I'd lost myself. Everything was about the kids, about the house, about bills and schedules, and it felt like I was suffocating. And then he came along, and he actually listened, he actually noticed me. Listened? I said, barely holding back a laugh. You're seriously trying to tell me that's why you did this? Because you needed someone to listen? She glared at me, a spark of anger flashing in her eyes. Yes, John, believe it or not, that's exactly why. Maybe if you actually took an interest in me once in a while, I wouldn't have needed anyone else to talk to. So, this is my fault now? I shot back, the anger rising in my voice. I didn't cheat, Emma. I didn't lie. I didn't sneak around with someone else, you did. Her gaze faltered, and she looked down at her hands. I'm not saying it's your fault. I'm just saying, maybe if things had been different. Oh, sure, I scoffed. If I'd been more attentive, if I'd read your mind and figured out that my wife needed a damn affair to feel noticed. Do you even hear yourself right now? You're trying to excuse what you did by saying you didn't feel noticed. Well, guess what, Emma? Everyone feels unnoticed sometimes. It doesn't mean they throw everything away for some fling. She flinched, but I wasn't done. I'd spent enough time holding back, enough time giving her space, giving her every benefit of the doubt. Not anymore. Did you bring him here? I asked, the question burning in my mind. Did you bring him into our home? Her face went pale, and I saw the guilt clear as day. She didn't even have to say it. I already knew. You did, I said, my voice dropping. You brought him here. You brought him into our house, into our space. Our kids were under this roof, Emma. Were you ever going to tell me? Or was I just supposed to stay in the dark forever? I didn't think it would last, she said, her voice barely audible. I thought it was just something to get me through a rough time. But then it got more serious, and I didn't know how to stop. More serious, I repeated, my hands clenched so hard I could feel my nails digging into my palms. How serious, exactly? Are you in love with him? She hesitated, and that hesitation told me everything. She didn't answer right away, and that silence was the loudest confession I'd ever heard. I don't know, she said finally, her voice breaking. I thought I was, at least a little. But it's not like that. I don't want to leave you, I don't want to end our marriage. You don't want to end it? I laughed bitterly. Emma, you ended it the moment you started lying to me. The moment you let someone else get close enough to matter. You ended it every time you came home and pretended like everything was fine. That's what you chose. Not me. She started to cry, and it almost looked real, almost looked like she actually felt something for what she'd done. But I couldn't find it in me to feel sorry for her, not now. This was a mess she'd created, and I wasn't going to let her worm her way out of it with a few tears. What am I supposed to tell the kids? I demanded. What am I supposed to say when they ask why everything's falling apart? Oh, sorry kids, but your mom needed someone who would notice her, so she decided to burn everything down. That's what you want me to say? Her tears fell faster, and she shook her head. Please, John, I never wanted to hurt you. I didn't mean for this to happen. It was a mistake, that's all. A mistake? I repeated, feeling my anger spike again. A mistake is forgetting an anniversary or missing a parent-teacher meeting. A mistake is not screwing around with some guy you met at work and dragging him into our lives. You don't get to call this a mistake. I took a breath, trying to calm myself, but it was useless. All I could see was her standing there, looking at me with those guilty, tear-filled eyes, like she actually expected me to forgive her. To go back to the way things were, as if she hadn't ripped everything to shreds. You know what, Emma? I said, finally standing up. I think you've told me enough. You've made your choices, and I think it's time I made mine. What does that mean? She asked, her voice trembling. It means, I said, keeping my voice as cold as I could, that you can take whatever little feelings you have for this guy and run off with him. Go ahead. Pack your things, go stay with him, get it all out of your system. Because you're not staying here, not tonight. Her eyes widened, and she looked genuinely terrified. John, please, we don't have to do this. Let's just talk it through. We can figure something out. I don't want to leave. Well, that's too damn bad, I snapped. Because you don't get a say in this anymore. You lost that right when you decided to do this. So, go. Go stay with your friend and see how much he actually cares. Let him see you like this, let him hear the story from your side. I'm done listening to it. She opened her mouth to argue, but I held up a hand, cutting her off. Enough, Emma. Just go. Take whatever you need for tonight and leave. We'll talk tomorrow, or maybe we won't. Right now, I don't care. She looked at me like I was some stranger, and maybe I was. I'd never been like this with her, never had to be. But she'd brought it to this point. She decided this was the way things were going to go, and I wasn't going to sit around and let her make excuses. Slowly, she got up, wiping her eyes, her hands trembling as she reached for her things. She picked up a bag, hesitated, and looked back at me, as if she was hoping for some last-minute reprieve. I didn't give it to her. Finally, she turned and walked out, leaving me standing there in the bedroom that no longer felt like ours. I heard the front door close behind her, and for a long moment, I just stood there, staring at the space she'd left behind. All the emotions I'd been holding back came crashing down at once: anger, betrayal, sadness, and something close to relief. At least now, I knew. The pretending was over, the doubts, the wondering. It was all out in the open, and there was no going back. I wasn't sure what I was going to do next, but I knew one thing: I wasn't about to let her walk back in here like nothing had happened. She'd made her choice, and now, it was time for me to make mine. Emma left without a word that night, and I spent the next few hours in a haze, replaying every detail over and over in my head. She'd walked out as if it was just a temporary spat, expecting we'd work through it somehow. She'd even left some of her things, like she thought she'd be back soon to pick up where we left off. The arrogance of it infuriated me. She thought she could go off and come back whenever she felt like it, that I'd just be here, waiting. That confidence, that certainty, was the thing that finally pushed me over the edge. The moment the anger hardened into resolve, I knew I couldn't just let this slide. She'd decided to blow up our life together, and I wasn't about to let her get away with it without consequences. She wanted to play games? Fine. I could play games too. But mine wouldn't leave her any wiggle room. The first step was getting a plan together. It wasn't just about hitting her back, it was about making sure she felt the weight of every single lie, every betrayal. I'd given her everything: 15 years, our family, stability, all of it, and she'd trashed it like it was nothing. If she wanted her life with this guy, fine. I'd help her move on, permanently. Step 1: cutting off access. I started with the bank accounts. I went through every joint account we shared and changed the passwords. Savings, checking, the kids' college fund, she was locked out of all of it. We had our own separate accounts too, but she'd been using our joint ones for most of her expenses since she hadn't bothered to set up automatic transfers for her paycheck into her own account. She'd gotten used to the convenience of having everything shared, everything accessible. Well, that convenience was gone. Next, I blocked her from the credit cards. I'd kept the master account for both cards we used, and I called the company to report her card as lost. I requested a replacement and made sure the new one would only have my name on it. Within an hour, her access to our credit line was wiped out. I knew she'd be furious when she figured it out, and frankly, I didn't care. This was the price of betrayal. She thought she could have her little fling and keep her life with me intact? I was done with that idea. It was time she learned just how much she'd relied on the stability I provided, the stability she thought she could so easily throw away. Step 2, the house. She might have thought she'd stroll back into our house once she cooled off. She'd left without much, after all, just a small bag. I knew she'd want to come back, to grab her things or maybe even to try to talk me down. But the idea of letting her set foot back in here, in the home she'd tainted with her lies, was out of the question. I took the key to her car and drove to the hardware store that night, picking up a new lock for the front door. I didn't waste time. Within an hour, the front door had a brand new lock, and I'd already packed up some of her things into a few boxes. Nothing big, just the basics, just enough for her to get by without needing to come back anytime soon. I set the boxes by the garage, out of sight but easy for her to pick up. She could call me if she wanted the rest. But she wasn't coming back inside. Not now, maybe not ever. By the time I finished with that, it was nearly dawn. I was running on adrenaline and spite, and even though I was exhausted, I felt clear-headed for the first time in hours. There was a satisfaction in taking these steps, in making sure she wouldn't just walk back in and try to smooth things over. This wasn't about forgiveness, this was about her understanding that actions had consequences, and hers had come due. Step 3, the social side. Emma had always been a social butterfly. Our friends, our families, she kept them all close, and they all thought the world of her. She'd built up this image, this perfect, sweet, devoted wife and mother image that people loved. I'd fallen for it too, at one point. And it made me sick to realize she'd been feeding everyone that same lie while sneaking around behind my back. So, I decided that people deserved to know the truth. I didn't go about it dramatically. No public posts, no announcements. I started with her parents, actually. I'd always had a good relationship with them, and it wasn't their fault their daughter had turned out like this. So, I called her mother and calmly explained what had happened. She was shocked, of course, but she thanked me for letting her know. Her father wasn't as diplomatic when he got on the phone. He apologized profusely for Emma's behavior, promising that they'd talk to her, try to set her straight. It wasn't about getting them on my side, it was about making sure Emma couldn't twist the story. She couldn't play the victim, couldn't claim this was all some misunderstanding. She'd have to face the truth, with no room to dodge or deflect. After that, I called a few close friends. I didn't go into detail, just enough to make it clear that things were over and that her choices had been the cause. They were stunned, of course, but I didn't stick around to answer questions. I just told them I'd be fine, that I needed some time to process, and left it at that. Step 4, documentation. Emma worked in a conservative industry. Her job wasn't just her passion, it was her identity. She prided herself on her professionalism, on her reputation. Her boss was an old-school type who'd never tolerate any kind of scandal, especially not one involving his employees. And as I sat there, thinking over all the moves I'd made so far, I realized I had one last card to play. I'd saved every text, every email, every detail I could gather since I'd confronted her. I hadn't been sure what I'd do with them at first. But now, as the day wore on, I felt a grim satisfaction at the thought of her explaining her little mistake to her boss. I spent hours organizing everything. Every screenshot, every piece of evidence I'd collected, went into a file. I didn't leave anything out. By the time I finished, it was nearly evening again. I could feel the weight of what I'd just done, and I knew she'd hate me for it. But that was fine by me. I wasn't trying to win her back. I wanted her to understand that there was no going back. That night, I went to bed feeling more at peace than I had in weeks. I knew what I'd done was harsh, but it felt right. She had walked all over our life together, betrayed everything we'd built. The least I could do was make sure she felt the same kind of loss. Step 5, Final Message. It was late when my phone finally buzzed with her name on the screen. I didn't answer right away, I let it ring, let her sweat a little. When I finally picked up, she sounded frazzled, desperate, her voice cracking as she asked what I'd done. "John, you locked me out of the house," she started, her voice barely holding together. "And the accounts, why would you do that?" I kept my voice even. "I did what I had to do, Emma. You made your choices, and now I'm making mine." "Are you serious?" she whispered. I said I was sorry. I said it was a mistake. "Why are you doing this?" "Because sorry doesn't fix this, Emma," I said, not letting her words get to me. "You knew exactly what you were doing every time you went behind my back. Now you get to see what happens when you stop getting away with it." There was a silence, and I could hear her trying to find words, trying to come up with something that would make me relent. But I didn't give her a chance. "I've already talked to your parents, by the way," I continued. "I figured they deserved to know what's going on. And don't worry, they don't think it's a misunderstanding either." She let out a sharp breath, her voice breaking. You didn't tell them everything, did you?" "I told them what they needed to know," I said coldly. "And I'm going to make sure everyone else knows too. I'm done pretending." "John, please," she whispered. "We can fix this. We can talk it through, work it out." "No, we can't," I said firmly. "You should have thought about that before you decided to throw everything away. You made your bed, Emma. Now you get to lie in it." I hung up without waiting for her reply. There was nothing more to say, nothing she could do to undo the damage. She'd chosen her path, and now she'd see exactly where it led. Emma called and messaged relentlessly after that, but I ignored every one of them. Each time my phone buzzed with her name, I felt the urge to answer, to let her beg, to hear whatever version of an apology she thought would save her. But I wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. She'd had every chance to make things right, to come clean before it all got to this. She chose her secrets, chose her lies. Now, she was going to live with them. That was my plan, anyway. But after 3 days, I got another call, this time from our lawyer. Emma had reached out, and she wanted to meet. She was apparently looking to sort things out before things got ugly. I laughed when he told me that. Things were already as ugly as they could get. The lawyer mentioned, however, that Emma wanted one last conversation, somewhere neutral. I agreed, mostly out of curiosity. I wanted to see how she'd try to spin things, wanted to see if she'd finally have the nerve to be honest. We met at a small cafe on the other side of town, the kind of place she would have never chosen before. The place was dimly lit, private. It was early, barely anyone there, and I chose a corner table with a view of the door. I wanted to watch her walk in, wanted to see her face when she finally had to look me in the eye and see what she'd done. When she arrived, she looked a mess. Gone were the polished outfits, the makeup, the perfect hair she always put on for the world. She wore a simple sweater, jeans, and her face looked drained, pale. She hadn't slept good. I hadn't slept well either, so it was only fair. She spotted me and walked over, every step hesitant, her eyes darting around like she was afraid someone might be watching. "John," she said, her voice barely audible as she took the seat across from me. "Emma," I replied flatly, not bothering to hide my anger. "You wanted to talk. So talk." She flinched at the coldness in my tone but nodded, looking down at her hands. For a moment, she was silent, as if she was trying to gather the courage to speak. But I wasn't going to make this easy for her. She'd taken enough of my time, enough of my patience. So? I pressed. She looked up, her eyes glassy, as if she was on the verge of tears. "John, I don't know where to start." "Try the truth," I said, crossing my arms. "Something you haven't tried in a while. She let out a shaky breath, clearly struggling to hold it together. I'm sorry, John. I'm so sorry. I know I hurt you. I know I messed up. Yeah, I'd say that's an understatement, I replied, my voice sharp. But go on. I never meant for any of this to happen, she said, her voice trembling. It started out as just a distraction. I was feeling, I don't know, lost. Like I was just going through the motions, and he noticed me. I almost laughed. The same excuse again. So that's it? You felt ignored, and he paid you some attention, and you just threw everything away for that? She shook her head, wiping at her eyes. It wasn't like that. I mean, maybe it was. I don't know. I felt like I was suffocating, like I was invisible. And I know that's not your fault. It's just how I felt. Right. You felt invisible. So you thought, hey, I'll go get noticed by cheating on my husband, I replied, the sarcasm thick in my voice. Real solid logic there, Emma. She winced but didn't argue. I know it sounds stupid. I know it was wrong. But it's over. I ended it. You ended it? I scoffed, leaning forward. Emma, it ended because I caught you. If I hadn't seen it, you'd still be sneaking around behind my back, wouldn't you? She looked away, her silence answering the question. I felt my fists clenching under the table, the anger boiling up again. How could she sit there and pretend this was just some mistake, something that could be brushed off with an apology? So, what do you want? I asked, forcing my voice to stay calm. Why are we here? She took a deep breath, glancing up at me with a look that I almost didn't recognize. There was desperation in her eyes, a pleading look that made my stomach turn. I want us to work this out, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. The sheer audacity of it stunned me. Work this out? I repeated, unable to keep the disgust out of my tone. Emma, are you out of your mind? Please, John, just hear me out, she begged. I know I don't deserve it, but I can't lose you. I can't lose our family. I'll do whatever it takes. Counseling, therapy, anything you want. Just, please, give me another chance. I shook my head, unable to believe what I was hearing. You had 1,000 chances, Emma. Every day, every time you lied to my face, you had a chance. And you chose to keep lying. You chose him. It wasn't like that, she insisted, her voice breaking. I didn't choose him over you. It was a stupid escape. I know that now. I know I messed up, and I know I hurt you. But I love you, John. I still love you. Love? I repeated, feeling a surge of anger so strong I almost stood up and left. You call this love? You call lying, sneaking around, humiliating me, love? She flinched, fresh tears running down her cheeks. I know it doesn't make sense. I know it's not what love is supposed to look like. But I do love you, John. I do. I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. If this is love, Emma, I don't want any part of it. You don't destroy the people you love. You don't lie to them, betray them. You don't make them feel like fools. She reached out across the table, her hand shaking. Please, John. Don't end it like this. We've been through so much together. We can find a way through this. I'll do anything. Just, don't give up on us. I looked at her hand, then back up at her face, feeling a mixture of anger and pity. She wanted to save herself, to avoid facing the consequences of her actions. She wanted a way out without having to suffer. And part of me wanted to give it to her, just to end this whole mess and let her deal with the fallout alone. But another part of me, the part that had been crushed by her betrayal, couldn't let her off that easily. You know what the sad part is, Emma? I said finally, my voice cold. I would have done anything for you. I would have fought for this family, for you, if you'd just been honest with me. But you couldn't even give me that. You couldn't even respect me enough to tell me the truth. She bit her lip, her face crumpling. I'm sorry, John. I am so sorry. Sorry doesn't cut it, I replied, my voice hard. Sorry doesn't fix what you broke. We sat in silence for a long moment, her sobs the only sound between us. I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me, a realization that this was it. This was the end of us, the end of everything I'd thought we had. And for the first time, I felt ready to let go. I can't do this, Emma, I said, my voice quiet but firm. I can't be with someone I can't trust. I can't be with someone who doesn't respect me enough to be honest. She looked up, her eyes wide with shock. John, please. We can work through this. We can rebuild. I'll prove to you that you can trust me again. I'll do whatever it takes. No, Emma, I said, shaking my head. I'm done. You made your choices, and now I'm making mine. We're done. She reached out again, desperation in her eyes. John, don't do this. Don't throw everything away. I'm not throwing anything away, I replied, standing up. You did that. You made this choice, and now you're going to live with it. I turned and walked away, not looking back, not giving her a chance to say anything else. As I stepped out of the cafe and into the fresh air, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. It was over. The lies, the betrayal, the anger, all of it was finally behind me. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe. After walking out of that cafe, I knew there was no looking back. Emma and I were over, and no amount of her apologies or explanations would change that. What she'd done couldn't be undone, and I wasn't about to live my life wondering if I could ever truly trust her again. That wasn't the life I wanted for myself or for our kids. They deserved better than parents who stayed together out of convenience, or out of fear of facing what came next. In the days that followed, I started the process of separation. I called my lawyer, filed for divorce, and had the paperwork sent to Emma. I was meticulous in laying out the terms: joint custody of the kids, division of assets, and clear, unbreakable lines about who would have what. I was fair, if anything, I was more than fair. I didn't want this to turn into some long, dragged-out war. I wanted it clean, definitive, something that would allow us both to move on without unnecessary conflict. Emma texted and called, of course, her messages ranging from pleas to anger, to attempts at bargaining. She wanted to meet again, to work things out for the sake of the kids. She even suggested counseling, as if we hadn't already crossed the line of no return. I ignored most of it. I'd already made my decision, and nothing she could say would change that. Finally, she showed up at the house one afternoon while the kids were at school. I'd left the front door unlocked because I'd been going in and out, packing up a few things I planned to take to my new place. She let herself in, calling out my name as if she still had the right to walk into my space uninvited. "What are you doing here?" I asked, not even looking up from the boxes I was filling. She stood in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes swollen. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept in days. Part of me wanted to feel sorry for her, but I couldn't. I'd given her every chance to come clean, every chance to be honest, and she'd chosen her path. This was her mess to deal with now. "John," she began, her voice shaky. "We need to talk. Please, just hear me out." "I already have," I replied flatly. "You said everything you needed to say. And I've already made my decision. Just give me 5 minutes," she begged, her voice breaking. 5 minutes, and I'll leave if that's what you want." I sighed, setting down the box and crossing my arms. "Fine. 5 minutes." She took a deep breath, glancing around the house as if seeing it for the first time. Her eyes lingered on the family photos, the little touches we'd added over the years, things we'd picked out together. I could see the pain in her face, the regret that was written all over her expression. But I wasn't about to let that sway me. I'd been through enough. "John," she started, "I know you don't believe me, but I didn't set out to hurt you. I didn't wake up one day and decide to throw everything away." I didn't respond, just waited for her to continue. She seemed to take that as permission to go on. I know I can't change what I did, she said, her voice trembling. But you have to believe me when I say that I love you, that I love our family. I didn't realize how much I needed it until I almost lost it. You did lose it, I replied, my voice cold. That's exactly what you did, Emma. You threw it away. And now, you're trying to pick up the pieces, but it's too late for that. Her face crumpled, and she looked down at the floor, clutching her hands together. John, please. Think about the kids. They need us. They need their family to stay together. And what kind of family would that be? I shot back. A family built on lies and broken promises? Do you think that's what they deserve? I don't. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. We can get past this. People make mistakes, and they find a way to move on. We could be stronger after this if you'd just give me a chance to prove myself. I felt a flash of anger at her words. She still didn't get it. She still thought this was something she could fix with enough apologies, enough begging. But this wasn't just some mistake, it was a betrayal that went to the core of everything I thought we had. You had your chance, Emma, I said, my voice harsh. You had every chance in the world to come to me, to tell me the truth. But instead, you chose to lie, to sneak around, to betray everything we built. And now, you want me to pretend like none of that matters? You want me to just forget it all? She opened her mouth to reply, but I didn't let her. I was done hearing her excuses, done listening to her attempt to justify what she'd done. No, I said firmly. I'm not going to let you twist this around. I'm not going to let you make this about us needing to stay together for the kids. They deserve better than parents who stay together out of guilt. And I deserve better than a wife who doesn't respect me enough to be honest. Her face fell, and she looked utterly defeated. John, please. I shook my head, taking a deep breath to steady myself. No, Emma. I'm moving on. And you're going to have to do the same. For a moment, she looked like she might argue, like she might push back one last time. But then she just nodded, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of it all had finally hit her. She turned and left without another word, walking out of the house, closing the door quietly behind her. I stood there, listening to the silence that followed, feeling a strange sense of peace settle over me. The divorce was finalized a few months later. We agreed on a custody arrangement that allowed us both time with the kids, and I took the house, while Emma moved into an apartment closer to her job. The process was clean, efficient, exactly what I'd wanted. There were no outbursts, no dramatic fights over assets. She knew better than to push. She knew I was done, that I wouldn't tolerate any further games. In the weeks that followed, I found myself slowly coming back to life. The anger and betrayal faded, replaced by a quiet determination to move forward. I focused on the kids, on being there for them, on making sure they felt as little impact as possible. They knew about the divorce, of course, but we kept the details minimal. All they knew was that their mother and I couldn't be together anymore. It was hard on them, and there were nights when the weight of it all felt overwhelming, but we got through it together. Friends and family were supportive, helping in any way they could, checking in on me, making sure I wasn't alone. My parents offered to take the kids for weekends now and then, giving me time to process, to rebuild. I found solace in the small things: work, hobbies I'd put on the back burner, even just going for long drives to clear my head. Slowly, I felt like myself again. One evening, months after the divorce was final, I ran into an old friend at a local bar. He'd gone through his own rough breakup a few years back, and we spent hours talking, sharing stories, laughing about the absurdity of it all. He looked at me with a seriousness I hadn't expected and said, "You know, John, sometimes life knocks us down so we can see things from a different angle. It's brutal, but maybe it's the only way we learn what really matters." And he was right. This whole experience had forced me to re-evaluate everything, to look at myself, at my choices, and see where I'd let things slip, where I'd given too much or held back when I should have spoken up. I didn't blame myself for Emma's choices, that was on her. But I realized that maybe I'd been too complacent, too willing to overlook the little things that could have made a difference. In the months that followed, I rebuilt my life from the ground up. I focused on the kids, on giving them the stability they needed. I reconnected with old friends, took on new challenges at work, even started dating again, slowly, cautiously. It was strange, learning to trust again, learning to open myself up to the possibility of someone new. But it was also liberating, a reminder that life didn't end with one betrayal, one heartbreak. Emma and I kept things civil for the sake of the kids. We communicated when necessary, exchanged updates, kept things as amicable as possible. She tried, now and then, to reach out, to suggest catching up over coffee, but I always declined. I wasn't interested in going backward. My life was moving forward, and I was done looking back. Looking back now, I can see the lessons that came from it all. I learned the importance of honesty, of not ignoring the little things, of not letting comfort turn into complacency. I'd been through hell, but I'd come out the other side stronger, wiser, and more determined to live my life on my terms. As for Emma, I don't know where her life is now, and I don't particularly care. She made her choices, and I made mine. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally living for myself, for my happiness, my peace. The future was mine to shape, and I wasn't about to let anyone take that away from me again.